But I think those three things, transparency and career path, transparency and compensation, and then having a means by which to learn first and then potentially move into a more like business development type role. I think those things all support all humans, but especially women.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Advice Business Podcast. Kelsey, I am excited today because I feel like we haven't had a guest on an episode in a while, and it's sad. I like talking to you, but having another person on the podcast
I think we talk
mediate
enough.
Is always helpful.
Yeah.
I know.
Yeah.
Exactly.
I love a guest. We're so excited.
To have some outside perspective and shake things up a bit. And we're talking about a topic we've talked about before, but you could do an episode on this every week in this space as we talk about financial advisors trying to hire people. So if you think about that as a general topic, I think advisors struggle with even how to think about that as a process in general. Who am I hiring? For what role? How do I write a job description? We talk to a lot of advisors about some of these fundamental things. But then there's this layer on top of that, which is how do you think about hiring through the lens of sort of NextGen advisors? How do we actually attract, develop, and hopefully then retain top talent that is hopefully coming into the industry and get them into a seat that helps you grow your business and helps them be successful in their career. So Kelsey, who do we have today to kind of help us through this conversation?
Yes, we are so excited to welcome you. We have Natalie Taylor on this episode with us. She is the founder and CEO of the Goodland Group. Welcome, Natalie. We're very, very excited to have you.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're so excited. Maybe you could just start off by introducing yourself and a little bit about your background just for listeners so they can get kind of the context of where you're coming from as we enter this conversation.
Sure. I am a financial planner. I own and founded the Goodland Group about 5.5 years ago, but I've been a financial planner for over 20 years. I started, it was the first job I could get out of college because my older sister's college roommate was a financial planner and she said, oh, you could do this. And so I tried it. So that's how I became one. I worked in a private practice serving pre-retirees for my first 7 or 8 years. And then I took a pivot into fintech and I worked for LearnVest. And so we built the first of its kind digital RIA. And that really kind of blew my mind and blew the lid off of what I thought was possible in our industry. And it really helped me think differently about pretty much everything. And then I did some consulting in the fintech space for companies like SoFi and Elvest and LearnLux and others. And then I launched this firm 5.5 years ago to serve mid-career professionals in tech with significant equity comp. So I've got a team there's 3 of us, and we're actually in the final stages of hiring our 4th team member, which is exciting.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for providing your background. And I've been you're very active on social media. So I've been kind of following your hiring journey for these last few roles. So I'm hoping some of this comes up in our conversation since we are talking about attracting next-gen talent. And you do talk a lot about talent publicly on social media and when you join other podcasts, webinars, that sort of thing. So I'm just curious, with wearing all of these hats, how did you become so interested in this topic? What makes you so passionate about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think starting at a traditional firm and seeing, I was with an American Express financial advisors before they became Ameriprise, but I was a young female financial advisor. And at that time, most advisors were men and they were much, much older than me. And most staff, so paraplanners, services, client service associates, et cetera, they were women. And so it was uncommon to see any women who were advisors. And the ones who were there had fought their way through, and they were 30 years in the business. And I'll be honest, they were the hardest on me of anybody. Mm-hmm. They were not like a welcome, young woman, come on in. Let me invite you into the fold. It was kind of like I had to do it the hard way and you should too. And so it was really isolating. And that being my first experience for the first 7 or 8 years, then I shifted to working at LearnVest. And LearnVest was just a whole other thing. So the average age at LearnVest was 26. We were a fintech startup founded by a woman with female leaders. I think everyone on our E-team was women. Almost all of our CFPs were women in the early days. And it was a bunch of like young Harvard grads, and we were building something fundamentally new. We were doing things in a different way. We were building client first. And it just sort of blew my mind on, okay, like things don't have to look how they look. And then I think after I left LearnVest, going back into our industry, it was like, gosh, well, where can I land? Because I've been ruined of the old school sort of paradigm. I wasn't sure if I wanted to stay in fintech. I really love client work. And so that's what led me to building a firm. So I think that's where I really started to like notice it and experience it over time and see this like very stark difference between the traditional financial services industry and then this fintech version of financial services.
Natalie, can you talk about the perception of the quote unquote pipeline problem in the industry? It was interesting to hear you say, what was it, your older sister's roommate who was an advisor? And so, a little bit for you personally, a bit of a happenstance situation that you got exposed to the industry. And so I'm curious, how much of that is the overarching problem? This thing about younger talent in general, but women specifically, being aware of the industry, the career pathing in the industry. How much is that truly part of the problem? Or maybe not so much? How do you think about that part of the equation?
Yeah, I think we've come a long way when I started in this business, I don't think there were any undergrad or maybe even grad programs for financial planning. It just wasn't a thing. Nobody talked about behavioral finance in terms of personal finance. And so I think that having an education path, I think has been a real positive for women entering the industry. But I think at the end of the day, even with the progress that we've made, there's still most firms are owned by men and run by men. And the advisors are still men and the partners are still men. And so I think it's still hard for women to see themselves at all levels. And I think as I've interviewed, we're hiring right now, and I had 148 candidates apply for the role, and we got to a top 8, and all of my top 8 were women. And I promise you that was just coincidence. Those were the top 8 candidates. But I can tell you that some of them voiced, I was interviewing with another firm and noticed that no one in leadership and no one who was an owner was a woman, and let alone a person of color. And it let me know that there's probably not a path forward. Even if they say there is, there probably isn't. And I think that's difficult because how is our industry and how are those firms supposed to transform and evolve and attract more diverse talent when that's the case? And I think the way you have to do it, and I've gotten lots of messages on LinkedIn over the years of like, we are a male-owned, male-run firm, but we don't want to be this way forever. We really do want to change. But I feel like when people look at our website, they see male, stale, pale, and then they're not attracted to working here. And so my advice to those owners and partners and advisors are, when you're looking to attract more diverse talent, you have to go outside of your regular network. And I think you have to call it out. I think you have to say, because I think women and people of color, I can only speak for women. I am not a person of color. I think probably the things are similar in this way, but I'll just speak for women. Not that all women are the same either, but I think you fear being the token woman on the team. And I'm just here to fill a placeholder. And so for me, I think that if firms really called it out and said in their job description, we do not have the diverse talent that we think would make us a better firm. And we are actively trying to solve that problem. We are looking for diverse thinking. We are looking for, I think if you call it out, then I think women would be attracted to it. And I think that's the thing that doesn't get said, because understandably, I think firm owners are sort of scared to say the wrong thing. But I think calling it out and being honest about it is actually like key to those firms being able to transform. It'll take time, but I think that's really key to be able to address it in a way that allows women and people of color to really truly feel welcome and not feel like they're going to be the token.
Yeah, I love that you pointed that out. I feel like that's advice that we give a lot of, like, whatever the challenge is, like naming it, actually speaking to it, and addressing it directly is a huge first step, instead of worrying that you're just going to shine more light on it or you're going to make it more obvious by doing so. I think that's a huge first step. What are your thoughts on, because I've thought about this a lot, being at conferences, you get a lot of panels on like young talent and diversity in the industry, and you get questions. I've listened to a lot of questions from the audience. What would you say to a firm that's worried about feeling feeling like it's performative almost, because it's not enough to just say it. You also have to like embed it into your culture. You have to be actively trying. If you do have a firm that doesn't maybe look or represent the way that you want it to, and you want to improve diversity within your firm, how can you make sure that you're actually living that and breathing that day to day, so that when you do find that right candidate and you bring them in, they're going to feel like you didn't just sell them some line, and that it's up to you to come in and fix it, and like you just show up and it's going to change things. Like there has to be more to it within, in my opinion, at least within the leadership team and how the company is actually being run, to make sure that you're living that as the talent comes in and kind of tries to embed within the company culture, if you will.
Yeah, it's such a great question. Because it isn't just about getting the right people in the door. It's about it, the culture shifting alongside with it. I think the key is creating a space where that like minority hire. So again, I'll just speak of women, but where that woman who's been hired has an actual safe space to say what she needs and where she thinks the culture could shift to make the firm more welcoming and a better setup in general for women to thrive. And one of the things that comes to mind, my friend Kayla Kennelly, she worked at Pershing much earlier in her career, and they had I think they called it a reverse mentorship program, where the young people in the firm reverse mentored the executives. And I think, if I remember correctly, she got to mentor like the president or CEO of Pershing.
Wow.
And when we tied, she was like in her 20s. And so maybe even early 20s. But that gave a safe space for her to be able to say things. And I think it's important. Like, I don't know that a man would ever be able to know that, like, in the way that our industry traditionally prospects, that puts women into situations where we routinely feel uncomfortable, especially young women. And, I'm in my mid 40s now. It's different for me now. But gosh, when I started in my young 20s, going out to lunch one-on-one with a guy was not a comfortable situation for me, or going to have drinks, or going to a happy hour because it's a mixer where wealthy people hang out, or whatever our silly industry does. Those are not comfortable situations. I left my first job because I had somebody in power in the organization that I worked with. My manager came on to me, and I ended up leaving that firm. So I think it would be, we need those voices to be able to be heard in a place that's safe. And it doesn't mean that the firm has to take action on every recommendation, but I think being able to open those lines of communication to be able to increase the understanding of like, I never even thought about that. Like, that makes total sense. Or, there are some more obvious things like flexibility with work hours or having a parental leave policy. I think supporting working parents, not just working mothers, right? So if you're supporting working mothers in a way, but you're not supporting working fathers, then you're still singling out the women as like, this is an accommodation we're making for you because you can't handle what the men can handle. And so I think being able to, like, from an equal perspective, support working parents, because there's nothing wrong with a woman that she's the one that became the parent. So I think those kinds of things, when very well intentioned, we have a working mother policy, right? But I think for women to be able to have a safe space to say, actually, what would really be the most meaningful is to see working parents supported, so that I don't feel singled out as the woman who needed flexible time because that burden falls on me. So anyway.
Yeah.
It's interesting to hear. So that point about how do we put this person in a seat where they can express thoughts and opinions and sort of educate the existing people in a firm. But it is like a delicate balance of what you touched on earlier, of also not making it seem that that person is now in charge of fixing the problem, and putting that on the person and so I guess parental leave is a great example, but can you go, what other things come to mind of what are the table stakes things that a firm, before they go out and say, this is the type of person we're seeking to hire, we're calling out the problem, but like the things that they can have in place so that that person isn't the one that has to help accomplish foundational stuff. So again, I think the parental leave example is like a very specific practical thing, but is there anything else that comes to mind that, the foundational things that you could have in place if that person does choose to join you and you want them to, yes, educate you, but also not solve every single foundational problem, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I love that question. I think things like a clear, externalized and transparent career path is helpful. I think that allows an employee to feel like there is a standard that is known by all, that is held for all, that if I meet these, benchmarks, then I have progress, instead of it being sort of conditional of like, oh man, if I don't go to drinks or if I don't talk about the game. I mean, I talk about sports a lot, but like that sort of traditional, like if I'm not part of like the bro culture of my firm, then I'm not going to get promoted. So I think even things like having a clear and transparent career path with really clear benchmarks of, if you get these designations and you can handle this type of work and you do a good job in X, Y, and Z measurable ways, that you will then progress. I think that is helpful, and that's helpful for everybody. And one I think that goes alongside that is clear salary bands, and not just sort of we've made some progress there, right, with some laws in some states, but not the like, well, it's anywhere from 40,000 to 150,000. So I think having like sure, you need a band, right? It can't just be everybody who does this role is going to get exactly this amount, but transparency of how compensation works, I think, is really important. I also think coming into a sales role, this is somewhere that I think actually our industry has made a decent amount of progress from what I see. There are actually ways that you can come into a firm as a paraplanner or as a client service associate and sort of move up the diamond team in ways that 20 years ago, those paths weren't well defined. It was smile and dial, phone clinics. If you couldn't produce, you were out. And as a 22-year-old that looked 14, that wasn't, it turned out I was good at it, but it felt terrible because I didn't know anything. And I was like, I don't want people to hire me because I don't know anything. So I think the heavy sales practices at the front end, if you don't feel like you're coming in with the network that would then, like, did you have a bunch of wealthy people at your wedding that you want to call up? If not, that puts you at a disadvantage compared to your peers. Or if that's just socially not something that you feel comfortable doing, I think those kinds of things. And again, I think that's a benefit for anybody who's coming into the industry to not have to do that as their first thing. I do see progress in that area, but I think those three things, transparency and career path, transparency and compensation, and then having a means by which to learn first and then potentially move into a more like business development type role. I think those things all support all humans, but especially women.
Yeah, since we're on the topic of women right now, I would love to talk a little bit about women advancing into leadership roles. Speaking of career path, obviously you're talking a lot about the early stages, but earlier you were mentioning kind of the value of seeing women in leadership positions and seeing that representation and being able to actually look at their career paths as an example of how to kind of move into leadership if you're not going to just go out and independently create your own firm. I would love to hear your thoughts on just the biggest difference between, if you have any, on the biggest difference between a firm where women are able to successfully advance into leadership and a firm maybe where that's more difficult to do, or it would be more rare to see it. Like, what would you say are some of the things outside of just kind of that standard career pathing that you think would make a firm more likely to be a place where a woman, if she's entering the industry now, what should she be looking for outside of those few things if her goal is to eventually kind of advance up into a leadership position?
I think seeing other women in leadership is one of the most important, I think that's a really important identifier, and there are more so than ever, I think, larger firms who have women in executive roles. We have Abacus that Neela is their CEO for 4 years now, and Mary Beth alongside her for 3 of those years. And we have Mission Wealth, that's another, multi-billion-dollar RIA with a female president in Donnell. So I think we're starting to see more and more of that. And I think that is certainly an encouraging sign. What I think is interesting is even in those firms, the firms are still predominantly owned by men, but at least we're seeing, these transitions take time. And so the ownership of a firm that's sort of an institution that's been around for many, many years, that's going to take time to become more equal, and that's okay. But I think understanding and seeing those steps, seeing women at every sort of stage with the firm, I think is really one of the most important signifiers. And if not, that the firm is actively calling it out and, actively committed to wanting to make that change. And I feel like, I put a voice to a lot of this stuff because I own my own firm and So I'm not at risk in a way, being able to say this stuff publicly and being able to call this stuff out. I don't have an employer that could be frustrated that I am sharing these kinds of ideas or these kinds of thoughts. Not that they're so revolutionary. I really hope that they're not. But I think I have a spot in this season of my career where I can say these things really clearly and plainly without repercussion.
Yeah, definitely. And then maybe we could talk about kind of the client side of all of this. So just to kind of step back and look at the overall business impact as a leader of a firm, what would you say, like having more women in these roles, how is that going to change the future for female clients? Or if you want to talk more broadly, even about just seeing greater diversity within the industry, how is that going to kind of impact positively the way firms are serving clients today?
I think clients will be better served by having a more diverse set of advisors available to serve them. I think I've heard way too many stories, and I'm sure y'all have too, of like female clients feeling completely dismissed by a male advisor. That still happens way too often. I have friends who have confided, gosh, we went to see a financial advisor when our babies were young, and she basically told me, you better get back to work. Or he, I think that female clients who are people of color, I think they will feel more comfortable and more likely to seek the help of a financial planner if they see themselves represented in our industry. We are predominantly men helping men. And so I think, and half my clients are men. So I love helping men. But I think when we see an industry largely dominated by male advisors, I think that makes men feel the most comfortable as clients. And so I think one of the very basic but really critical benefits is that female clients are more likely to feel seen and heard and known and understood. And same with clients who are people of color. I think the same goes there as well. I also think that whether it's due to wiring or conditioning or whatever, that women are great at seeing beyond the numbers and seeing sort of that other side, that human side, that behavioral side of all of this. And I think that is such an important skill for the work that we do. And I also think that our industry would be well served to move further away from product sales and AUM measuring sticks and produce, and minimal relationship enough to retain the client. I think that women will and do a really great job in terms of focusing on actual financial planning and focusing on building real connection. Not that many men do a phenomenal job of it. I'm just saying that I think women are exceptionally skilled with this. And I think that our industry will be better served by having that diversity.
This is a leading question, but I'm very curious your thoughts on it. We talk sometimes about, when you talk about men serving men, a lot of those men happen to be married to women. It seems to us like such an easy entree to actually bringing women into the fold of financial planning when that actually hasn't happened with married spouses very often. So anyway, I'm curious, that's one of the sort of like performative things we sometimes see of firms who talk about women clients as this sort of separate vertical, while meanwhile, maybe there's many women who are actual clients of the firm already who just are married to men, but haven't actually been brought into the financial planning process in a meaningful way, in starting from a discovery meeting with that couple at the beginning of the relationship. So again, very leading question and sort of off track on the hiring thing, but I'm just curious your opinion on that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I had a C-level exec of one of the biggest RIAs in the country talk to me about, I'm really struggling with whether we should name women as a niche on our website, right? We work with business owners, we work with, X, Y, or Z. And we want to go out and say, and we love working with women, like women is a niche. However, women are half the world. And so is it inappropriate for us to say that? Is that somehow belittling them to then lift them up? Like what's going on? And I totally empathize with the struggle of like, man, sometimes we just don't say anything because it's really hard to know the right thing to say. And sure. I got sorry for the tangent, but I got an email recently from someone who said, our firm really helps. We've found that female RIA owners are feeling extra stressed because they're struggling with growth. And I wrote back and then was selling their product. And I said, are you finding that men struggle with that too? And he was like, yes, we're just trying to say like, we want to work with women. We want to work with women owners. And I was like, I love the message. I was like, I'm so glad. And we had this really great back and forth about like,
that's great.
I wonder if you shifted your message to be less, we want to help you because you're struggling, and more, you have so much to offer and so much impact to have. And we want to be the back end that helps you do that. And you can still speak to women, but you're not solving the problem for them. You're helping them go do the thing that they are uniquely and wonderfully made to do. So I can't remember the person's name, but like we just had this great email back and forth. He was like, thanks so much for the feedback. And I was like, thanks so much for receiving it. So I think it's really tricky. And I understand the tough spot that firms, that men that are in, because it's like, gosh, it's just all so tricky and all sort of feels so fraught sometimes. But at the end of the day, I think it's very common for women to feel like, oh, sure, I guess we use that firm, but they only talk to my husband. Or I tried going to meetings and, the only questions they asked are is family time important to you? And, like that they just weren't seeing me as a real human and a real part of the partnership. And I think to some extent, especially generationally, but some women check out of that area. And I think that we as women need to not do that. Even if, whatever the separation of things, the division of labor in a partnership, whether it's a hetero partnership or a same-sex partnership or whatever, we are going to specialize in different areas. I don't do IT. My husband doesn't do financial stuff. Like, that's fine. Don't ask me to fix the Sonos. And he, so I think that's fine. But I think there's still a level of women needing to take responsibility and ownership in their own financial life and saying, I'm not just going to check out. I think our industry could do a lot to invite them in.
It's been this sort of like self-fulfilling thing for 40 years, right? And so we just talk about, just ask. In your discovery process, make it sort of a table stakes component of not presuming this person doesn't want to be part of the conversation. And as you know, often the inverse perception ends up being true, and therefore you're not actually building a good relationship with this couple. I also think, just to tie it back to the hiring piece, kind of putting that in the category of foundational stuff for attracting and retaining talent, because if you may have be projecting good culture and career pathing, but if your actual client experience is the opposite, like what you're doing from a client experience perspective. So how do you have that baked into sort of the foundational stuff to make sure people want to come and work for you?
Yeah, just
100%.
to tie it back to the talent thing really clearly, if you're a firm leader and you're looking at what you were saying before, Natalie, which is opening those lines of communication, another huge benefit is having more diverse, a better perspective on all of these different steps in your customer experience and your employee experience. Because to be fair, the whole system was set up to be men serving men. So all of these more legacy tech products, there's so many touch points that were just designed in the old way, and it's going to take a lot of time, I think, to unravel that. But if you can't really spot it, because it's to your point earlier, it's not really something that you're as aware of, that's another huge benefit of having a really open line of communication between maybe younger women in your firm or more diverse perspectives in your firm and the leadership team. Zach and I talk all the time about things that we see in the industry, to the point where Zach now sends me things that he knows that I'm going to have an opinion on, because it's one of those things where if you just want to get different perspectives on it so that you can say oh, this tool wants us to onboard somebody in this way. Do we agree with that? Don't just, you have to look with a critical lens if that's your goal at every single step. It's not just about the discovery meeting or just about, there's so many places where it pops up throughout the entire customer journey. So I think it's very well tied into what you were saying earlier.
Yeah, absolutely, Kelsey. Things like, is it client and spouse in the data form? Or the fact that we typically default to the male and then the female name in any sort of naming convention in the way that we name files, right? If husband and wife have different last names, whose last name are they under in your files? And you've got to have a default, right? So we all have to have an agreed upon way, but a lot of times those things women notice, Chase wants to sell things and State Farm would love to sell some life insurance to my husband, and they have never tried to sell life insurance to me. I don't know why, but something in their system
sell
is
me some life insurance.
And my husband has no idea who our State Farm agent is, whereas I have been reviewing our policies annually with her for years. So, it's those kinds of things that I think women can take note of, and then like respectfully bringing attention to, right? I think there's something to be said for the way that we bring attention to these things, that nobody is actively trying to hurt you, but these institutional things are really frustrating and there's room for change. And so how can we use our voices in a way that they can be heard? And I don't mean to be controversial in that way. I think but I think there's something there too.
It makes sense. I think, there's layers and so many steps for firms to try to figure out how to get this right, or as close to, or whatever right means, but as close to right as they can get. So we talked about sort of the concept of the pipeline problem, but really what the real dynamics there are, how firms can maybe start to address those underlying foundational things. Can we go to logistical, right? We want to say these things about who we want to attract. We have thought through parental leave. We've thought through basic cultural stuff. We've thought through some of the client experience stuff we need to fix. How do I find this person? How do I interview this person? How do I screen people, right? You talked about, for yourself in your process, 100 plus, how do I get those 100 plus people to fill out a form? Mm-hmm. And then how do I kind of go through that process? I think firms, always need reminding on some of these sort of practical things and how to do it right.
Yeah, we have a really specific hiring process, and shout out to Danica Waddell and Jake Northrup, who I was in a mastermind with for many years, and we sort of iterated on this together and brainstormed it together, and we all do a different version of it. But for us, so we listed on Simply Paraplanner, and that's where the vast majority of our candidates came from this most recent hiring cycle. Last year, I just used LinkedIn, and I think we had 60-something applications. So Simply Paraplanner really helped us get the word out on the opening. And then from there, we asked them to answer a simple Google form to talk through what their experience was, whether they were okay with the salary range, where they see themselves in 3 to 5 years, a couple short answer things just so we could see how they write and what they say and how much work they put into it. And then some things that allowed us to filter of like, how many years of experience do you have? Where are you in your CFP journey, et cetera? And that allowed us to get from 148 candidates to 42 candidates. And then from there, we had them each send in a less than 5-minute Loom video. And we purposefully asked for it to be Loom for a couple of reasons. One, a lot of people still have never used Loom, and we wanted them to be able to use it. It's free, but we wanted them to figure out the tech to use Loom well. And then from a safety perspective, I feel really comfortable clicking on a Loom link from a candidate. Whereas if they just send me a file, I'm not going to feel as comfortable. So maybe I'm too careful with that kind of stuff, but from a cybersecurity perspective. So we had them send a 5-minute Loom video, and we gave them 3 questions to answer. One was, tell me the journey of your career. One was, tell me why you want to work here specifically. And the third one was, explain at a high level a mega backdoor Roth, so that we could get a bit of a sense of how they sound. From there, we were able to get down to 8 candidates. And so with those 8, I did interviews. As a prep for those interviews, I send out 3 case studies. I try to balance, I don't want to ask for too much time from a candidate because I respect their time. And especially if they're applying for multiple jobs and or have a full-time job currently, I want to be really respectful of their time, but it really helps me see what their work looks like. And so we had one on building a basic Google sheet that compared investing in real estate versus investing in a stock and bond portfolio. We had one that was writing an email to a client who didn't understand how to do a backdoor Roth. And then we had one that was a brief scenario of a couple who wanted to buy a bigger home and wanted to know if they could afford it. And I didn't even ask them to solve the second one. I just said, how would you approach it? What kinds of information would you need? How would you think about it? What considerations would be on your radar? And then during that first interview, we spend half of it doing regular interview stuff. And then the other half, and I have them do a self-evaluation of all the financial planning areas. I have them rank themselves. So the second half of that first interview, we go through each case, and no matter what, there's positive and negative feedback. And sure, there's things they did well, there's strengths and areas of growth, but like there's positives and negatives. And so part of what I'm looking for is, I can see how they think as they do the cases. I can see where their gaps are, but I also am really attuned to how do they accept feedback? What was their thought process going in? And then how do they respond when they get feedback, both positive and negative? And then with the self-assessment, I'm trying to gauge how much do they know that they don't know? Do they have a reasonable understanding of where their gaps are or not, and how do they handle it when I put them on the spot to ask them, okay, you gave yourself a 10 in investment strategy. Can you explain direct indexing to me? And if they're like, I've never heard of it, I have no idea. It's like, okay, well, you might not be a 10. So that's what we do in our first interview. Then Cindy does an interview, then Miranda does an interview. We do disc assessments and reference calls. So that's our specific planning or hiring process. And, small sample size, but it works really well.
That's great. That's such great feedback. Maybe as we kind of come to a close here, is there anything else you'd like to share? Just any other advice or anything we didn't ask you that we should have asked you that could really kind of build on this conversation and everything we're discussing here today?
I think one of the important things for firm owners to know is that you don't have to compromise on talent to hire diverse talent. It might look a little bit different, and you might have to go outside of your normal network to find a more diverse pool of candidates. But there is not some underlying expectation that you are compromising on the quality of candidates that you're looking for. But there might be a little bit of extra effort in finding that diverse pool. And so my encouragement to you is to go and find that more diverse pool, but not to compromise your standards. For me, legitimately, the top 8 candidates were all women. I was surprised when I took a step back from the 148 entries on the Google form and had, ranked everybody and had my top 8. And I went, oh my gosh, these are all women. That was a surprise to me. I just want to make sure that that's not, some sort of like unsaid thing here. There is no compromise of talent, but I think it's the understanding that the talent, you might have to go out of your regular network to find it. And there might be some other things to develop that talent, but I think it's well worth your while.
I'm glad that's the thing you thought of here at the end as that final point, because I do, to your point, think that presumption is continuing to linger, which is a bummer. So thank you for mentioning that. Natalie, this has been really helpful, really insightful. The tactical stuff, again, sort of big picture, how to think about these things, some of these tactical components. I think advisors, the industry struggles with all of it. So I'm very hopeful that people listen to this and think about what we're talking about. What else? Anything that you want to share about what you and the firm are doing next? Up and coming stuff? Anything you want to shout out before we wrap?
Thank you for the opportunity, but but not really. I used to do a lot more speaking engagements, but the practice has been growing quite quickly and my focus has been there. But yeah, if you are interested in following me on LinkedIn, I am fairly active on there. And yeah, but that's it. There's nothing else going on.
Love it. That's easy.
Yeah.
We appreciate it. Thank you so much for joining us. And thanks everybody for listening. We'll see you next time.